And then there were 5. The 5 ranged DPS specs we have left. After going through Demonology and Fire, all the way at the bottom, we went through the chasm of C to meet the clump of balanced and viable ranged DPS specs in B tier. Now we go into the top 5, the elite 5, and we start with Frostmage. We start with Frostmage because Frostmage has been recently cock-blocked from entering S tier by a set of brutal nerfs we're about to go over. But first, my fellow glass half full chads, we're going over the positives. Frostmage has very good sustained single target damage, as it is often the case for specs with no real strong cooldowns for burst, but that's not why you bring a mage to a raid. That's not why you bring a frost mage to a raid. If you wanted strong single target, you could have went for Affliction. If you wanted strong burst, you could have went for Arcane. What you bring a frost mage for is for the best cleave in the game. Very high sustained AoE damage and one of the best funnel and priority target damage in the game. That's why you bring a frost mage. Frost mage has a very nice synergy in their funnel and priority damage because their blizzard is going to reduce the cooldown of Frozen Orb. And then when you play Frozen Orb, you're going to be hitting multiple enemies. Every hit is going to increase the chance that you proc Fingers of Frost. And when you proc Fingers of Frost, your Ice Lance turns into a nuke. And when you talent into Splitting Ice, your Ice Lance now hits 2 targets. You see the point. You're fighting a boss that has 1 primary add up and then 3 to 4 small ones. A Frost Mage can put down the Blizzard, massively reduce the cooldown of Frozen Orb, put the Frozen Orb down, machine gun of Ice Lances, extremely high damage. That's their strength. The other strength, arguably, is that they have no ramp up time. They have no resource, they have no runes, they have no energy, they have no combo points, they are just ready to go. They drop the Blizzard, they drop the Frozen Orb and then just ready. Extremely powerful in these type of settings in a raid encounter when you really need to go fast. They have great mobility, being a mage obviously with their blinks, and they have great survivability. Being Frost, they also have access to Cold Snap, so even better. On to the negatives though, because they're not S tier, despite all my praises. So what's the problem here? Problem is they are still dominated by RNG. Their spec only works if they are Fingers of Frost and if they have Brain Freeze. When they don't, you are hard casting Frostbolts for 7 casts in a row, and it feels miserable. It's low damage, and it's not satisfying at all. The other problem is their cooldown. Their cooldown is embarrassing. Icy Veins is a 3-minute pseudo Bloodlust. You don't even do that well as a Frost Mage with haste anyways. It's just not very good. Obviously, with having bad cooldown comes having bad burst. Frost Mage has terrible burst. They have very good, extremely short combos of high burst. Like, you throw down a Flurry, and then you throw down your Nuclear Strike, Ice Lance, and then maybe a Glacial Spike in, 2-3 GCDs. That's a lot of damage, but for burst, I mean 10 to 15 seconds of high damage. They don't have that. They don't have spread cleave of any kind. They are very compact as a spec with their Blizzard and their Frozen Orb, and they are very limited in talent variety, because as it stands, they are locked into Lonely Winter, they are locked into Shimmer, into Chaining Reaction because their Ice Lance is everything, they are locked into Splitting Ice because their Cleave with Ice Lance is everything. The only minor option is in the last tier where they can go Thermal Void for extra burst, as if they had it, inside their Icy Veins, or for the Cleave with Glacial Spike. But that's very, very little option you have as a Frost Mage. Their Mastery has still remained the same, which has been a problem in the past. Their Mastery essentially does not scale their Ice Lances, which can create a problem that has happened in the past, where Frost Mage essentially bypasses Ice Lance completely. They reach a situation similar to Vengeance Demon Hunter, where you can generate your souls as a Vengeance Demon Hunter and your icicles as a Frost Mage so fast that it's more effective to simply overcap and let them automatically discharge. This is a bad system. It scales badly in damage, and it's even worse because it's gonna suppress your Ice Lance. So that's still a problem. And the other problem, as I mentioned at the start, they have currently been nerfed quite heavily. Their 2 strongest legendary, Cold Front and Freezing Winds, have been butchered. Cold Front used to give you a Frozen Orb every 15 casts of Frostbolt. It was nerfed to 90, and now it's been toned down to 60. And their Freezing Winds used to reduce the cooldown of your Frozen Orb by 2.5 seconds whenever you casted Frostbolt. That entire part has been removed completely. So that's really bad. Luckily, partially luckily, they have gotten a new buff in Glacial Fragments. Now their Ice Lance is going to be an even stronger Nuclear Strike, although this is stronger for Mythic Plus and for AoE and for padding, not for priority damage and cleave. So it's still minor, it's worse compared to the other 2 for raiding. All in all, Frost Mage is still the best and most complete of the mage specs, and it has a very nice niche, which is also very good. You don't like to be good in everything but not excel at anything, so there is always a class that can beat you, there's also a spec that can beat you. Frost Mage does have some niches where they can be the most effective at, which is very powerful. Once upon a time, I repeatedly put Markmanship Hunter into C tier, as I refused to acknowledge the state of marksmanship in the beta because of their overtunedness and overpoweredness. Now, after several rounds of changes, I guess I have to face reality and deal with the fact that Blizzard considers this acceptable and viable and, balanced. So, Markmanship Hunter is in A tier. It's a pretty good spec. It has a very good niche that is going to be viable in Castle Nathria. Let's look at it. They have very strong sustained single target damage, and they particularly excel at sustained AoE and 3-target cleave, with no need for CDs, no need for setups or anything. They just do it very, very easily for very high damage. One of the better points of Markmanship Hunter is they have a good variety of talents they can choose for all types of situations. Things like Serpent Sting, which allows them to dot multiple targets in cleave, is very strong. Things like Martial Marksman for extra single target is very strong. They can go for Explosive Shot for extra AoE, or they can go for Careful Aim, which is a very good ability for extra burst. When a new priority target spawns, with Careful Aim they can do a lot of work. They can do even more work when they take double tap. This is what makes them also very strong at shorter burst windows. If burst window is already short, there is also the shorter burst window. Not 10 to 15 seconds, but 3 to 4 to 5 GCDs. Hunter is extremely strong when they do that. When they have their trick shots, when they can use their aim shot to ricochet to multiple targets, and with their legendary Serpent Stalkers, also autocast Chimera shots, using double tap to double cast their aim shot, and increasing in damage by 50% because they have Careful Aim, it's a gigantic amount of burst. Yes, of course, over 10 seconds, over 15 seconds, they will lose to any spec with good burst, because their burst is over after that combo, but it's extremely powerful. And that's not enough, because if they don't need double tap, if the damage profile of the fight doesn't require it, they can go for Deadeye, for Killshot, for Execute phase. They can go for Volley in the last row, which is an extremely powerful AoE talent, and Cleave on 3 targets, is why I mentioned being strong in 3-target cleave, because Volley is going to also enable trick shots, and trick shots is going to also enable your aim shot AoE ricochet style, which is very powerful. This also comes with a good variety of legendaries. As I mentioned, their all-star MVP, Serpent Stalker's Trickery, with their mega 3-target cleave on aim shot and chimera shot, but they do also have surging shots, which has been recently buffed. It is very, very strong for single target. Buff the damage of rapid fire, and then make your aim shots have a chance to reset the cooldown. This will be even stronger when you will be able to use 2 legendaries at the same time, because then you will also be able to use Secrets of the Unblinking Vigil. Now trick shots, rather than simply giving you AoE, is going to recharge a charge of aim shot, increasing your single target even further. Those are all good options. They are all variable options on top of your talents that you can choose from. Being a hunter, of course, they have great mobility. They don't have the best, of course, because they're not BM hunter. They have to hardcast some of their abilities, aim shot primarily, and they still have good defensives. Aspect of the Turtle is the king in that sense, and immunity. Coming for the negatives though, for Markmanship Hunter. As I mentioned, they are mobile, but not that mobile compared to BM Hunter. When you need a mobile hunter, BM is always going to be the pick. Their utility is lacking. Not that they had it before, but it's still lacking because they don't have a pet. No, don't say that a Markmanship Hunter can still summon a pet. They won't, okay? Don't count MM Hunter as having a pet. Their cooldowns are of course trash. They pretty much only have one cooldown, True Shot, and it's awful. Just awful. They have no spread cleave as a ranged DPS spec, and currently they have been nerfed compared to what they were before. If they stayed as they were before, they would have been S tier. Now they are just A tier. But similar to Frost Mage, they're going to stay in A tier, and they're going to be very viable because they have a very powerful niche. But as I mentioned, the same for Frost Mage. You would rather be a 5 out of 10 in 2 types of damage profile and a 10 out of 10 in 2 types of damage profile, rather than being a 7.5 out of 10 in all damage profile. Because if you are a 7.5 out of 10, there are always going to be specs better than you. Whereas if you are a 10 out of 10, you can be specialized. You can always be the best at that role. And obviously, the more 10 out of 10s you have in your kit that match the damage profile of Castle Nathria bosses, the better it's going to be. Things like Cleave, things like Priority Target, Single Target Burst, as well as Funnel, being able to increase your single target damage while hitting multiple targets, all of those are going to be extremely powerful in Castle Nathria. And Markmanship Hunter has a couple of them. It makes them very viable. Next! Destruction Warlock mains were sweating at the end of BFA, knowing how much stronger they had gotten thanks to borrowed powers, thinking they would have been destroyed. With the release of Shadowlands, losing all the borrowed powers, they saw the state of Protection Warrior and Fire Mage with all their borrowed powers lost, with things like Flashpoint giving them like 200% haste, things like Rolling Havoc, tripling their intellect, Vision of Perfection, spawning their back-to-back-to-back Infernals, also triggering their Azerite trait. It was insane. It's a testament to how nicely made and built the spec is. The fact that they lost all these borrowed powers and they are still just fine at the start of Shadowlands. They have very strong cooldowns. Infernal coupled with Dark Soul instability is extremely powerful. They have very good burst in single target because of it. They have extremely high burst in AoE and one of the strongest burst in cleave, thanks to their fellow friend, trusty friend, Havoc. They can also be very powerful in sustained AoE and as well as in funnel, although this requires more tinkering with talents and legendaries. Destruction has now something called, still called, Fire and Brimstone, which is going to make your incinerate AoE, hitting every target, giving you 2 extra soul shard fragments, meaning essentially you're hitting 5 targets, you're generating 1 soul shard. You can even double down on this for the memes, and you can go Embers of the Diabolic Raiment to give you double the generation on soul shard fragments when you incinerate. And this is basically what happens, as you can see in the video. It's just constantly generating soul shards to constantly stack Rain of Fire damage and then have a heavily reduced cooldown on your Infernal. You can then also use Rain of Chaos. Having Rain of Chaos is going to also spawn multiple Infernals because you're spamming and expending so many soul shards. This is giving them very strong AoE, which in fairness is what is making them so much stronger in Mythic Plus, not so much in raids. This is not going to be very important in a raid encounter, because what's important in raid encounter is other things they are good at, which is things like burst cleave, priority damage, and similar things, not straight up AoE. But they can be improved in this type of things with other very good legendaries. You have Odor, recently buffed, is going to basically make your Havoc 25% stronger, as if it wasn't already one of your strongest point. Madness of the Ajakir is going to be very strong later into the expansion. Right now it's kind of tough to keep it up, you know, only 3 seconds of buff. Basically the casting of your Chaos Bolt already baseline, so it's gonna take some haste and some scaling to make this very powerful. But then you still have your very trusty, albeit slightly nerfed, Wilfred's Sigil of Supreme Summoning, reducing the cooldown of your Infernal per soul shard spent, which makes them strong in things like funnel and priority damage, because the more targets there are, the more fodder there is, the more soul shards you can generate, meaning you can spend them faster, meaning you can use more Infernals, which is very powerful. Another things to add to their bonuses and to their pluses is that they have basically no ramp up time, beyond something almost every other spec has, which is pool your resources as a general rule of thumb before your burst. All they have to do is put Immolate on the target and then they're good to go. Their amount of ramp up is very, very small. Being a Warlock, they have very good utility in a raid because of their Hellstones, because of their Portal, and even because technically they still have a combat rest. Looking at the downsides, of course, for having such a high burst, they have a much lower DPS outside of their burst window. The only sustained high damage they have is going to be on AoE because of this specific talent legendary setup. They do have poor instant mobility. Yes, they can have a teleport for themselves and Burning Rush, but that requires premeditation, the teleport. They don't have a blink or a dash to immediately put them out of danger if they didn't already plan ahead with their teleport. Another thing is that their talent variety is pretty non-existent due to how locked in they are to certain choices. Something like Flash Over, like Reverse Entropy, like Reign of Chaos and Dark Soul Instability are sort of a lock. Reign of Chaos and Dark Soul Instability, because of how strong your cooldown is, you need to take further talents to make your cooldowns even stronger. Flash Over is just the only decently competitive one, at least until you can stack enough haste and borrowed powers to make your Chaos Bolt spam a thing again. Up until then, it's not going to be challenged by the other 2 choices in that row. Reverse Entropy, same thing. Shadowborn is mostly pointless in raid encounters, more useful in Mythic Plus. The only option is going to be Fire and Brimstone if you want to go for that AoE type of build, otherwise you just go back to Cataclysm for your burst. So you are pretty limited in talent choices. Lastly, your defensive is pretty poor. You have only 1 defensive, it's not that strong. What you're stronger at is your normal overall sustain. Your passive health percentage shield that you can get is good, but when it comes to actual defensives, you're pretty poor. Overall, Destruction is in a pretty nice spot. They fill a very nice niche, close to the 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, which is what will make you wanted in a raid encounter, which is very nice. And despite being not the best Warlock spec, they don't suffer from class envy. They are perfectly fine on their own. They don't need to seethe and complain about the OPness of Affliction. Talking about Affliction, let's go into the S tier. You know, starting with our first S tier spec, we have to go basically the opposite way. We have to start with the negatives. Affliction Warlock is pretty slow to ramp up their damage when it comes to new targets coming in, especially when you're playing for something like Cleave and Dot Cleave and Spread Cleave, and you're playing with Siphon Life. You have to use Unstable Affliction and then Corruption and then Curse of Agony and then Siphon Life on 1 target. If there is 3 targets, you know, that's a long time. If they had to be burst down, good luck. So that's a negative. The other negative is that they have poor 2-target cleave. It's one of those situations where they are better at hitting multiple targets or just one. If you're hitting two, you're kind of just hitting one and letting your dots on the other and nothing else, which is not as powerful as what they can do on multiple targets or a single one. They do have poor mobility, same as Destruction. They can pre-plan their mobility with their teleport, but Burning Rush is not very powerful when it comes to immediately getting out of danger. They are not extremely mobile, and then of course their defensives are poor, and by defensives I mean 1. They're only defensive, they're unending resolve. 20% DR is terrible. They do have, though, as a Warlock spec, more defensives. They can use Drain Life more effectively than other specs. For Warlock, they can also talent it to make it even stronger. They also have Siphon Life, which can heal them. Kind of squishy. But that's kind of it. Now we have to talk about the positives. And I am in a position of embarrassment, because I just taught you, I just trained you to believe that if you have strong burst, then you can't really have good sustained damage. If you have strong sustained damage, then you shouldn't really have burst. But when it comes to Warlock, Affliction kind of has great damage profile in like all profiles, except for pure to target cleave. They have amazing sustained single target damage, they have very high sustained cleave, they have very good sustained AoE damage. Okay, but that's enough, right? They have done their sustained damage. Let the good specs with the good burst take the spotlight now. No. Affliction also has burst. Their Dark Glare, their Dark Soul Misery give them very strong single target burst and extremely strong single target burst in funnel situations. They still have an extremely powerful AoE burst, and they still remain with the best spread cleave in the game. A lot of this is given to them by the variety they can choose in their talent options. Their talent options can give them even stronger, for example, execute phase, single target. They can remove their boring ass Shadow Bolt, which took forever to stack the Shadow Embrace buff to 3 for the 9% more shadow damage, and instead go for Drain Soul. It's gonna make it extremely fast to stack up Shadow Embrace, and it's gonna give you essentially double damage in execute phase. Talking about synergy, they can then take Decimating Bolt, the Maldraxxus Covenant that is going to massively empower your Drain Soul. That is going to be very powerful for execute. If they are fighting in spread cleave situations, 3 to 4 targets as the priority, they can go for Siphon Life and just add an extra DOT. They can go for Phantom Singularity when they want the burst AoE, or Vile Taint when they want the consistent sustained AoE damage. If you're back again into the spread cleave and few target cleaving scenarios, you can go for Haunt, a short burst of damage for a quickly dying enemy. If you want the big burst window, you can go for Dark Caller, reducing the cooldown of your Dark Glare to line up with Misery. And in the last row, you can go for Misery for your big burst, or if you're back into the cleave multi-target spread cleave scenario, you can just go for Creeping Death, or massively increase damage of DOTs over all of the targets. This gives them a lot of variety, a lot of options and possibilities when they want to choose which way to do damage. There are also legendaries that they can line up with their choices, things like Wrath of Consumption in those cleave AoE situations where they can guarantee multiple targets dying every time. 25% more DOT damage is insane for Affliction Warlock. Another similar situation could be Perpetual Agony of the Ajakir for just extra soul shard generation with your Agony, if you can guarantee Agony to be up on multiple targets. And lastly, for damage at least, they are the most varied Warlock spec when it comes to Covenants. Besides the all-purpose Scoring Sight for soul shard generation, Impending Catastrophe is extremely powerful because it gives you an extra DOT, which scales the damage of your Dark Glare and scales the damage of your Malefic Rapture, the more dots you have on the target. You can go, as I mentioned, for Soul Rot by talenting into Inevitable Demise, being able to actually make use of a Giga increased damage Drain Life on 3 targets, which is very powerful, and as mentioned before with Drain Soul, you can take Decimating Bolt for the extra execute damage. This is all just very good. You add to this the fact that you're a Warlock, so you have a Portal, you have a Combat Res, and you have Hellstones, and you are an easy S tier spec. Just way too many competitive damage profiles to choose from. They are looking very good right now. Affliction is an S tier spec with their type of damage profile, then it is no wonder that Shadow Priest is also S tier, considering they have a very similar damage profile. meaning they are basically good at everything except for 2-target cleave. That's the stage Shadow Priest is in right now. They have one of the best, likely together with Affliction, variety for talent and legendaries for the all different damage profiles in the game. They have the best DPS funnel in the game and the best spread cleave in the game together with Affliction. They have good to great sustained single target. They have great sustained AoE, good burst AoE. Finally, Shadow Priest has never had burst AoE ever. And they also have amazing execute phase damage. Now, if we were to look at a little bit of a correction compared to Affliction, they kind of need some more specialization in their talents to make all of these things possible. For example, Twist of Fate is going to massively increase their execute phase damage, but at the same time, they're not going to have great AoE if they don't take Searing Nightmare in the same row. Then goes for spread cleaving, taking Misery, which is going to cut them 1 GCD away and make them faster for that to happen. On a similar note, when it comes to cleaving and spread cleaving with dots, Unfurling Darkness is pretty good. When it comes to tagging new mobs, a couple of them every time to increase the damage of your Vampiric Touch, as opposed to Death and Madness, which is going to be extremely powerful in heavy cleave and AoE situations where you can guarantee multiple targets dying and Shadow Word Death having massive value. Other examples is Spread Cleave with Auspicious Spirits, increasing the damage of your shadowy apparitions to multiple targets, as opposed to Psychic Link for very strong splash damage consistent AoE, as opposed to Shadow Crush for burst damage. A lot of these things are going to be exclusive within each other, so you won't be able to have an all-round damage profile as well as Affliction, but when you specialize for one, it is extremely powerful, it is extremely good, and you're still competent and competitive in the others. They're just not extremely powerful anymore. This is particularly related to the difference between single target and heavy AoE. You still remain extremely good in spread cleaving. You know, you still have your shadowy apparitions, which are going to cast to all targets with Vampiric Touch. If we were to look at some of the negatives though, it is slightly harder to play. There are tighter windows for you to do your thing. You have your Void Form, your Void Eruption still, where you can do some work. It can be punished more for your mistakes, essentially. Your single target burst is also not excellent. You do lack, similar to Affliction, you do lack a Dark Glare. Your Void Eruption is not a Dark Glare, and your Mindbender is not a Dark Glare. Your Mindbender is more for AoE when you want to go for Shadow Flame Prism. AoE Legendary is going to have way more effect than single target. And as mentioned, your 2-target cleave is mediocre. You want to hit 1 target or you want to hit 4, 5, 6, 7 of them with all your DOTs. But that's just about it. They do remain with very similar competitive damage profiles, same as Affliction, which is going to be very powerful in Castle Nathria. Whenever there is a chump you don't care about, you can still dot it to gain more damage in single target. You can still use Shadow Word Death on it to gain more insanity for your single target damage, or cleave or AoE, or whatever you were doing. Those are very good types of damage profiles for Castle Nathria. All in all, it is an extremely competitive spec right now. Despite all the 50,000 rounds of buffs and nerfs and changes they are going through, so it's pretty difficult to gauge it correctly, but right now it's looking very competitive. And this was all for our Ranged DPS specs. We can see that apparently having a lot of dot cleave, spread cleave, and any way to funnel your damage to a primary target, as well as consistent cleave and high single target damage, is going to be very valuable in Castle Nathria, given the damage profile we have been able to see from the upcoming raid. And with this big chunk of a video, we are done. We are going to be looking at something else, meaning tanks and healers after this. It's gonna come eventually. It's gonna come, I don't know when. So I will leave you guys with this, again, bickering about which spec is OP, which spec is an OP, no, my favorite spec should be S tier, and whatnot. Another round of Fs in the chat for my currently dead old account, having to be a refugee in this new one. It's annoying and sad, but I thank you all for the support anyways, all of you, even you, my dear old subscribers, joining in 1, 2, 3 weeks late, realizing it long after. Still, thank you. So, go back to doing whatever you were doing. In the meantime, I'm going to play Tome.